Hello, I'm Kieran, and you are listening to DCQ, Dublin City Questions, a podcast where DCU students sit down with academic experts to explore how big ideas from IOR and politics to law and media shape the world around us. We're here to bridge theory and reality and bring university discussions to life, one question at a time. This week we have Evan and Leo talking to Dr. Ken McDonagh about CSDP, EU's relations with India, and many more topics. Let's get into it.
So let's get right in. So the first question we have for you today, Professor, is where is it here? You've written extensively on the EU's CDSP, and what do you see as the biggest gap between how it's theorized and how it's implemented on the ground?
I'll just start with it. Thanks very much for having me. Just a quick correction. It's Dr. Ken McDonagh.
Doctor,
I, I'm an
apologies.
associate professor, and our titles are very confusing. But I don't get paid enough to be called professor, so we'll hold off on that. But okay, back to the CSDP, CFSP, which is what I'm here to talk about. I suppose the key sort of question in research is to what extent have the various moves by the EU to develop a common foreign security policy, security and defense policy over the last sort of 25 years or thereabouts, is about presentation or how much is about real capabilities. And for much of the first period, from about 2003 on to certainly till 2016 or thereabouts, there was a lot of criticism that CSDP didn't really produce an awful lot. There was the battle groups were stood up, but they were never actually used. There were a number of peacekeeping and training missions and things like that in place. But really reached a peak around 2008 with the mission in Chad and sort of tailed off after that. So there was a lot of skepticism, I suppose, around the idea that the EU was developing any sort of military capability. That shifted from around 2016 onwards, with the launch of the EU security strategy, or the EU global strategy at that point, working towards the strategic autonomy and the EU global. Yeah, so that change, I suppose, at the political level with that sort of strategic thinking, which coincided with Brexit. It also saw in that period PESCO being put into operation, had been part of the Lisbon Treaty, that's permanent enhanced structured cooperation in the areas of security and defence, and that allowed European member states to come together to work on different capabilities, different initiatives on that basis. And then really from the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia in 2022, there's been a further acceleration after that with the use of the European Peace Facility to provide direct military aid to Ukraine, the coordinated use of EU funds to purchase armaments, but also the new SAFE and EU Rearm Initiative or Europe, Rearm Europe Initiative, which again has seen the combination of EU level funding up to 150 billion plus about 650 billion, depending on what member states decide to do with that. So there's definitely been a scaling up of the EU operating in the space with an increased focus away from projecting the EU's influence abroad, as it was with the missions and the battle groups, to one that's more about the European defence industrial base, European defence capabilities, and that's a recognition of the changed threat environment. You know that after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, particularly in the Baltic states and the Nordic states, as well as Poland and a couple of other countries, there's a real sense that the EU needs to do a little bit more in the defence space. Where there's a debate then as to what extent that is a replacement for NATO versus a complement to NATO. And within EU member states, there's quite a bit of disagreement on that. But minds have been concentrated by, I suppose, the other big seismic event, which is the second Trump administration, which has raised certain question marks over how effective NATO is as a security guarantor for Europe. What I would say, despite that huge amount of activity in the space by the EU, the key to all of this is it's still very much member state driven, right? So it's still very much down to what member states are deciding to do through the EU structures, through NATO structures, or through whatever structures they have at a national level. And there has been no sort of evolution towards the European Commission having any role in deciding when any of this stuff gets used. So even if you think of PESCO, any capabilities developed in that context belong to the member states who develop them, and they get to decide under what circumstances they're deployed or not deployed. So there hasn't been any shift towards the EU as a whole becoming a single actor in security and defence.
Thank you so much, Dr.
No problem.
Great. Well, how do you see Ireland balancing its neutrality with growing EU security commitments then?
That's a great question. So I suppose again, it sort of builds from that. This is a member state driven initiative. It's an intergovernmental process at the EU level, and that means, of course, that member states have a veto on any further integration, and more particularly have the right to seek opt-outs. So in the Irish case, we have since the Treaty of the European Union in 1992, better known as the Maastricht Treaty, there's been something known as the Irish Clause. So what evolves in the Lisbon Treaty into Article 42.7, which is the mutual assistance clause that's in the treaties in European Treaty of the European Union. There's a statement there that sort of any assistance given will not be in contradiction to the member states' strategic orientation or national strategy. And that was there because Irish negotiators sort of insisted on it being there back in the 1990s, and it's carried its way through. Within Ireland as well, around the Nice Treaty votes in the early 2000s, we had a supplement to the Irish Clause, which was the Seville Declaration, which was a sort of a coda signed by all of the other member states at that time to say that Ireland's neutrality would not be infringed by continued cooperation with Europe. And we also inserted a clause into our own constitution that prevents us from joining a common defence that is made by a decision of the European Council. So in a sense, there isn't a direct contradiction where there's legal protections to Ireland's traditional neutral stance, even though that neutral stance itself isn't in the constitution or very clearly set out in legislation. And we also found that in that first period of EU operations in this area, Ireland was a very active member. So we were on CSDP missions in Bosnia Herzegovina. We went to Chad. We were in training missions in Ukraine. We're part of the peace assistance mission to Ukraine as well. So we found much of what the EU has done in this space has been quite compatible with Ireland's traditional approach to peacekeeping, to supports of international law, and operating under the so-called triple lock, which involved UN authorizations for each of those missions we engaged with. So until quite recently, these things have been broadly in line with Ireland's sort of traditional security and defence policy. And we were helped in that space by disagreements at the EU level pre-2016 about how close or how coherent the EU should be in the space. That coherence has been helped by the UK leaving, even if it's been a big loss of capabilities. It's helped political coherence. And we're also helped by the presence of other military neutral states within the EU, Malta and Austria, who are still there, and previously Finland and Sweden. So what has changed then is, particularly post-2022, Ireland has become more of an outlier in this space. So there's perhaps a greater political significance to our difference, and at least there's less room for us to avoid scrutiny about our positions in security and defence, because as I said, Sweden and Finland have moved into NATO, so that's sort of been one way in which the EU is becoming more coherent. And Denmark, which until quite recently had an opt-out on CSDP and the EU structures because it saw NATO as sort of the only game in town, has removed that opt-out through a referendum as well. So Denmark is now within the CSDP structures fully. So that leaves ourselves, Austria and Malta, as the only of the 27 member states who aren't in NATO and aren't and have a different view on where CSDP should be going. So there might be decisions for Ireland to make on this in the future. Coupled to that, we have our own sort of assessment of our threat environment and our security environment. So we had the Commission on Defence report, we had the Consultative Forum on International Peace and Security over the last couple of years. And out of that, I suppose there's consensus and disagreement has emerged, right? So the consensus that has emerged is that we need to spend more on security and defence. We need to particularly address gaps in our ability to know what's happening in our air and at sea. So sort of maritime and air domain awareness. And there's sort of a commitment to meet what the Commission called level of ambition 2. That would bring us, a basic radar capability, some improved naval capability, some improved air capability, and developments in intelligence and cybersecurity structures as well. And that's kind of consensual. I mean, if you go back and look at the manifestos at the last election, every single party, I think, except for Aontú, they were the only ones who didn't explicitly say level of ambition 2 is where we want to get. And within that, we have opportunities with PESCO and through our Partnership for Peace operations with NATO to address some of those issues in collaboration with others without affecting neutrality, because it's not about a mutual defence clause. Where there's more disagreement is what emerged from the Consultative Forum on International Security Policy. And that was a proposal by the then government, and you still have two of those parties in power at least, to remove the triple lock. And that was to remove the requirement for UN Security Council approval in order for there to be an Irish military deployment abroad. And that's created a much greater debate. We saw that in the recent presidential election. I mean, President-elect Connolly was very explicitly in our support for neutrality and framing the removal of the triple lock as a threat to that. And interestingly, I mean, if you look at the statements that emerged from the Humphreys campaign, they're prefaced by, we're very much in support of neutrality, but we see, giving Russia a veto, or giving the United States a veto, or giving Britain a veto on when we use or engage in peacekeeping or peace enforcement operations is something that we should look at. So there has been, it does seem to have polarized around that debate. But interestingly, and this is sort of a common feature of Ireland's debate on this, neutrality itself is really not up for debate. There's no major political forces arguing for Ireland moving towards NATO. Again, all of the manifestos in 2024 stated explicit support for neutrality. As I said, in the Humphreys campaign, that was there as well. So there seems to be, I suppose, a gap between what the stakes of this debate actually are, which is about a sort of a technical amendment to our legislation and when we agree to deploy troops, and how that relates to our broader strategic capacity. Now, there is a small group of voices, and I think John O'Brien out in Maynooth will be one of these people, who would argue very strongly that Ireland should be considering NATO. And there is, from the outside, a perception that it's unusual that Ireland, given our economic interests, our political orientation, our engagement with other European and Western structures, that we're not having that conversation. But I don't think I would see, I wouldn't predict any major change in that strategic orientation in the short term. And as I said, we have those legal protections constitutionally and within the European treaty structures that would allow us to maintain that. Now, whether the line that we're walking within that is accepted by everybody or not is open to debate. So, for example, on the European Peace Facility, Ireland didn't block the use of those funds to arm Ukraine. But what it did instead was there was sort of a carve out that a certain proportion of those funds, which would be the ones that would come from Ireland, would be used for non-lethal military aid. So that would be things like helmets, armored protection, even fuel, but not, buying ammunition or buying weapon systems and things like that. Similarly, we made a donation of a radar system, but that was supplemented by a donation from Sweden, which gave the missiles that work with the radar system and allow that to target Russian forces. And so from the outside, I mean, if you're looking at potential adversaries, the Russian ambassador in Dublin has been very, very clear that Russia does not see Ireland as neutral in the context of its conflict with Ukraine. And there are probably consequences of that feed into the consensus on why we need to spend more on security and defence. But I think the public debate and the political positions in the major parties are still very much in favour of neutrality.
So you don't see Ireland's position on neutrality shifting in any significant way in the foreseeable future?
I don't. To be honest, I don't think there's political will to push it in that way, and I think the way in which neutrality is defined in government policy as sort of narrowly military neutrality, I think that position will be preserved, and that would be the public position preserved, and we will continue to do what we've always done, which has had a political orientation towards our Western partners, providing non-military support in conflicts and causes that we agree with, whether that's in Palestine or it's in Ukraine. But I would see no major push or no shift in our position on say NATO membership, for example.
Okay. Well then, as part of the Global India project, we were wondering what has surprised you most about India's relationship with the EU, And where do you see the relationship heading in the next decade?
That's a great question. And so the first time I went to India would have been back in 2010, 2011, about then, the first time working on a project before Global India started. And I remember being quite struck. We were developing a module on EU security to be delivered in Indian universities, and they were developing a module on South Asian security to be delivered in European universities. So it was about creating dialogue between academics. And one of the questions that was put to me is, should we be worried about European tanks rolling over anybody's borders? Which I kind of laughed at when they'd asked it in that way. And it sort of reflected the way in which India finds the EU a little bit puzzling, right? Because it's not really sure what it is, and doesn't really isn't really certain whether it should be taking the EU as represented by the Commission and the European structures seriously, or it should really still be engaging in bilateral relationships with Berlin, with Paris, and with London, as would have been relevant at the time. And I think that uncertainty still persists, that there's a sense that India is happy enough to engage with the EU. I mean, they're big trading partners. The EU is India's largest trading partner, and India is the EU's largest trading partner in the global south. So there's significant economic engagement there. But politically, it's been, I suppose, a less cooperative arrangement than we might have expected if we look in the abstract, at least, at where India and the EU tend to stand. So they tend to both be in favor of multilateralism, in favor of international law, supportive of the institution, the post-World War II institutional structure, albeit India is seeking quite actively to become a Security Council member on a permanent basis. So there's a lot of areas where they overlap. They also share common concerns with climate change, and India is open to being a leader in that space, subject to what it sees as sort of climate justice and financial transfers from the rich global north to the rest of the world. So there's a lot of scope for action, but we've never really seen the potential for that manifest itself. Now, over the last 12 months or so, there has been a sort of renewed effort from both Brussels and Delhi to engage, and there was sort of a launch of a new sort of EU-India agenda for the next 10 years that's seeking to push towards a proper free trade deal between India and the EU, and greater cooperation and coordination in international institutions like the G20, like at the UN and so on. But we have heard this before, and it's come and gone in sort of waves between different commissions and different ideas. So it remains to be seen. There are also tensions in the European EU-India relationship, particularly that India has its long-standing non-aligned position, right? So India does not tend to engage with permanent political alliances in the international sphere, and always makes decisions around where India's interests lie. So, it's quite happy to engage with the EU on trade issues, but doesn't see that as extending to not engaging with Russia on trade issues. And it has close ties with Russia, particularly in the energy sector and also in security and defense as well. Likewise, it's open to cooperation with China as much as it is with the European Union, and doesn't see any contradiction from that perspective strategically. So there is a little bit of a tension between how the EU perhaps sees India as someone that wants to get into its camp, and I don't see India changing its strategic orientation in that way. And there might need to be something of a reality check at the European end, that we're dealing with what is maybe 10 to 15 years later than China, but what is now an emerging superpower at a global level. This is a nuclear armed state. It's going to be the most populous state in the world. It's going to be one of the largest economies in the world. And it's developing quite rapidly with its own network of interests, its own engagement in international aid. And so we're looking at a partnership of equality, or if there's a junior partner in this relationship, it will be the EU rather than India in the next 10 to 15 years.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And we move on to the last question now, Doctor. And the question for you is, you've contributed to policy training in women, peace and security. And we were wondering, what's the most effective way academics can influence the real world policy? And do you see any limits to it?
That's a great question, and it's one we're constantly asked to address because impact is increasingly part of how academics are in universities and institutions are assessed. So I suppose I've 3 points on the positive side of how we can do this, and then I'll talk a little bit about the caveats. The first is just academics saying yes, right? So we are busy people, despite despite perceptions externally, we do a lot of different kinds of work, and sometimes the policy engagement stuff is another ask, and it's another time commitment, and it's another thing to do. But we do need to engage with these audiences, so we need to say yes when we're asked. So, I've spoken to Oireachtas committees, I've chaired events and helped out with events with the Department of Foreign Affairs. I did the training at the EAS related to research I've done on movement, peace, and security. And so it's being open to taking your research and repackaging it, and being open to engaging with those audiences when the opening comes, because I've also been through cycles where I don't think the Department of Foreign Affairs could have found DCU at certain times over the 20 years or so I've been here. But now we're in a period where they are engaging with academics, so we should strike while the iron is hot. The second is sort of thinking about that translation aspect, that the way academics talk to each other can be quite obscure, and it reflects expertise and where debates are in the academic literature. And it is always about being aware, well, in what ways is this relevant to the policy world now? And how do I translate that? And that might be through to media engagement, it might be through creating blogs or policy papers based on academic research, and putting the information out there in a way that's more accessible to policymakers. And it's there with action points, with guidelines, with suggestions about what should be done, and risk assessments about what could go wrong. And sort of underpinning that is about the tough legwork of building and maintaining networks with the policy sphere. And that is about attending events and shaking hands and swapping business cards and saying hello and keeping in touch with people over time. And it's part of that natural networking we to do in other areas, and we should keep policy in mind as well when we're doing that. So it's about saying yes, translating your research, and maintaining and building those networks. Where the challenges come in, I suppose one is the first comment I made. It's workload. There's increasing requirements around teaching and learning in the university in terms of academic outputs. Its research outputs are recognized when it comes to promotion, and we're all rational beings who respond to signals in the system. So if they want journal articles, that's what they'll get, and writing the op-ed or the policy paper or doing the appearance might take away from that. So there are those issues that need to be taken into account. The second, obviously, is independence, that we shouldn't just be chasing around trying to justify what policymakers want to do. We're scientists of some shape or form for the most part, and so we're trying to produce good quality, evidence-based research about the world, and that may not say what policymakers want to hear. And that's sort of part of the tension there, that it's great to have good engagement with policymakers, but you have to be able to say, you're incorrect in your assumptions on this particular policy, or the evidence would suggest you should go in a different direction. And so policymakers can be quite selective in terms of what they want to hear from academic audiences, and often go looking for the evidence that supports a decision they've already made for a variety of other reasons, rather than wanting a sort of a genuine engagement. And that sort of depends on the level of politicization of an issue. And the Consultative Forum on International Security Policy is a good example of that, where you had a broad range of academic voices working within the field, both domestically and internationally. But it was portrayed by critics of that forum as just being about a one-directional broadcast to move Irish foreign policy in one particular direction. And you can see that in other areas that are politically contentious. So there is a real challenge it's a challenge for our societies generally, where how do you translate evidence into good policy? And sometimes we need to be a bit humble about this as well, that sometimes it's okay to disagree on policy as well. There could be good reasons to pursue one policy agenda versus another based on different normative starting points. So we can't evidence our way out of the politics of making public policy or international policy or security policy. It does come down to judgments and values that sometimes go beyond what the evidence can speak to.
Thank you very much. We appreciate that answer. If I could sum it up in, it's kind of based on three factors. So it's academics saying yes, as you stated, and translation, how we can actually translate these ideas and thoughts we have into actual policy, and then maintaining contact, as you said, swapping business cards, always emailing other academics. And the challenges we find with that, it's a heavy workload. Academics are very busy people. And then also the politicians with the policy, it might not be what they want to hear. And that's another challenge, especially for the academic community. So, but it is, it's a way we can fix it. And I do think I think there was great answers all around from everyone at the podcast tonight, it's this morning. Well, thank you very much, Dr. McDonagh. We appreciate your time and effort you put into this. Thank you so much. And we look forward to future podcasts with you.
No problem at all. Great to talk to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.